Some doors are locked for a reason. Some walls are thick for a reason. And some rooms are hidden for a reason. Tonight, we will uncover the terrifying truth behind 4 real-life encounters with places nobody was ever supposed to find. For as long as I could remember, the old Victorian house at the end of my street had been a silent sentinel of decay. Its once grand facade was now a skeleton of peeling paint and broken windows, the wrap-around porch sagging under the weight of neglect. The lawn was a tangle of weeds, and the only sound that ever came from it was the occasional scuttle of rodents or the moan of wind through shattered glass. I'd always been curious about it. Growing up, my friends and I would dare each other to sneak closer, but never closer than the rusted iron fence that circled the property. Our parents had warned us about strange things happening there, disappearing cats, faint cries heard on windy nights, but we dismissed it as ghost stories meant to keep kids in line. By the time I was 28, the house had become little more than background noise in my life. I worked as a graphic designer, lived with my girlfriend, Mara, and spent my weekends volunteering at the local community center. The house was just there, a blight on the neighborhood, a puzzle no one bothered to solve. That changed in the spring of 2021. The town council had finally reached an agreement with the heir, a reclusive tech mogul in Silicon Valley who'd inherited the property through a tangled web of wills and lawsuits. Volunteers were needed to clear decades of debris before the house could be demolished. I signed up, thinking it would be a straightforward way to give back and maybe satisfy a childhood curiosity. The morning of the cleanup, I arrived early. The sky was overcast, and a chill hung in the air, despite the late April date. A handful of volunteers milled about, the usual mix of retirees, teenagers, and middle-aged folks like myself. Mr. Thompson, a grizzled man in a flannel shirt, approached me. Been living here since '82. Never saw anyone go in or out. Place was always locked up tighter than a drum. I nodded, glancing at the house. The back door was slightly ajar, which seemed odd. Mr. Thompson shrugged. Guess the owner finally gave up. Let's get this over with. The interior was worse than I'd imagined. Sunlight filtered through broken windows, casting eerie patterns on walls stained with water damage. The air smelled of mildew and something metallic, like old blood. I made my way to the basement, drawn by the sound of dripping water. The stairs groaned underfoot, and my flashlight beam danced over piles of debris, crumpled newspapers, shattered glass, and what looked like old medical equipment. At the bottom, a flickering bulb cast long shadows over the chaos. That's when I saw it, a section of wall that stood out like a scar. It was smooth, painted a stark white that contrasted sharply with the surrounding grime. In the center was a small, brass handle, tarnished but intact. I hesitated, then pulled it. The wall swung open silently, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air grew colder as I descended. Each step creaked and my flashlight beam trembled. At the bottom, a door stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and my light revealed a room that didn't belong. A child's bedroom, painted pink, with a tiny vanity, a dollhouse, and a crib. But the crib wasn't empty. A small skeleton lay inside, its bones arranged neatly, as if it had simply lain down and died. Its tiny hands clutched a faded teddy bear, one eye missing. That's when I heard it. The whisper, soft but clear, "Mommy!" I froze. The voice echoed from every corner of the room, bouncing off the walls like a trapped soul. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw movement, a shadow darting behind the door. Then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence. I ran, stumbled up the stairs, slammed the wall shut behind me, and burst into the sunlight, gasping for air. The other volunteers were gone, probably driven away by the scream. I pulled out my phone and called 911, my hands shaking. 911, what's your emergency? There's a body in the basement, a child skeleton, and a hidden room. The police arrived 20 minutes later. Detective Alvarez, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, listened to my story with a skeptical frown. You're saying you found a hidden room with a skeleton, but now it's gone? I nodded, desperation in my voice. I didn't imagine it. The wall was there. She cut me off. We'll check it out. But unless we find something, this goes nowhere. They searched for hours. When they emerged, Detective Alvarez shook her head. Nothing. No staircase, no room, no skeleton. Just dust and old junk. I felt nauseated. Had I hallucinated the whole thing? Mara tried to reassure me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I dreamt of the skeleton, the teddy bear, the whisper, the cold laughter that followed me into wakefulness. The next day, I did some digging. The house had belonged to the Crawford family in the 1950s. Harold and Eleanor Crawford had moved in with their 6-year-old daughter, Emily, in 1952. For years later, Emily disappeared. The case was never solved. Neighbors recalled hearing her crying from the house long after she was gone. Some swore they saw a shadowy figure in the windows, rocking back and forth like a mother comforting a child. The Crawfords sold the house in 1961 and moved away, never to be heard from again. That night, I woke up screaming. Mara was shaking me, tears in her eyes. You were mumbling about a bear, a teddy bear. I couldn't explain it. For weeks, I was plagued by nightmares. The skeleton, the whisper, the feeling of small fingers brushing my ankle in the dark. I started sleeping with the lights on. I jumped at every sound. One evening, while browsing the town archives, I found an old article about a man named Thomas Whitaker, a handyman who'd worked on the house in the 1950s. His journal entries described strange noises and a presence in the walls. The final entry read, "They found us. I've locked her in the wall. Please, don't let her out." I couldn't shake the idea that Emily Crawford was still in that house, trapped between worlds, reaching out to anyone who stumbled too close. And I was terrified I'd become her next target. The house was demolished 6 months later. No trace of the hidden room was ever found. But sometimes, when it's quiet, I still hear the whisper. And in the corner of my eye, I see a small figure, pale, smiling, reaching for me, always one step behind. Some doors are locked for a reason, and some secrets should never be uncovered. I was the night manager at the Riverside Motel, a budget stopover for truckers, drifters, and travelers who didn't care about luxury. The place was a relic, a single-story building with faded pink paint and a neon sign that flickered like a dying star. Most nights were quiet, just the occasional slamming door or muffled argument. But room 17 was different. I'd been working the night shift for 2 years after my divorce. The job was simple: check guests in, handle complaints, and make sure no one set the place on fire. The motel was a relic, built in the 1960s, with rooms that smelled of stale cigarettes and old sweat. But it was steady work, and after my marriage fell apart, I needed stability. Room 17 was at the far end of the hallway, nearest the dumpsters. It was always the last to be cleaned, and the maids avoided it. Bad energy, they'd say with knowing glances. I dismissed it as superstition until the ghost arrived. He was a gaunt man in his 50s, with a beard streaked with gray and eyes that never focused. He'd pull up in a beat-up sedan, grab a duffel bag, and head straight to room 17. No small talk, no tips, just a crumpled $50 bill slipped under the card reader. The staff joked that he was a hitman or a drug dealer. I didn't care until he didn't leave. On the 4th day, maintenance knocked on my office door. Room 17's door won't open, they said. We heard noises inside. I grabbed my master key. The door was locked from the inside. When we broke it down, the room was empty, except for the suitcase. Inside were yellowed newspapers from 1987, all detailing the disappearance of a family in a small town called Millfield. The father, Thomas Whitaker, had vanished along with his wife and daughter after a break-in. The key to storage unit 13B was tucked in the corner of one article. I drove there at dawn, heart pounding. The unit was musty, but inside was a desk with a typewriter and stacks of journals. Thomas's writing was frantic, desperate. March 12, 1987. They're watching us. I hear them in the walls. I've moved Sarah into the crawl space. If they find her, they'll kill us all. The final entry was dated March 15th. They found us. I've locked her in the wall. Please, don't let her out. I went back to room 17, flashlight in hand. The floorboards creaked as I pried them up. Beneath was a trapdoor, rusted shut. When I forced it open, the stench hit me, a mix of rot and something sweet, like decayed fruit. The crawl space was narrow, barely tall enough to crawl. I inched forward, beam cutting through the darkness. Then I saw them, the bones. A woman's skeleton, curled into a fetal position, one hand pressed against the wall. But her eyes, they weren't bones. They were hollow, black sockets that seemed to follow me. I screamed and scrambled backward. The trapdoor slammed shut above me. Panicked, I clawed at the wood, but it didn't budge. Then I heard it, a whisper, muffled but clear. "Daddy." I kicked at the floorboards until my feet ached. Finally, with a splintering crash, the trapdoor flew open. I tumbled out, gasping, and slammed the floorboards back into place. The police arrived, but found nothing. No trapdoor, no bones. The owner sold the motel to a demolition crew. They tore it down, but workers swore they heard scratching beneath the rubble. After the incident, I became obsessed with Thomas Whitaker's story. I visited the Millfield Library, poring over microfiche of old newspapers. The Whitakers had moved to town in 1985, fleeing an unnamed threat. Thomas worked as a handyman, his wife, Clara, as a school librarian. Their daughter, Sarah, was 7 years old. On March 10, 1987, Clara reported hearing strange noises in the walls. 3 days later, the family vanished. The house was found ransacked, but no bodies were ever recovered. The case went cold. Thomas's journals revealed a deeper horror. He wrote of shadows moving in the corners of his eyes and a voice that whispered through the vents. The final entries were incoherent, a mix of pleas and gibberish. March 14th. She's in the walls. I can hear her laughing. Clara says it's Sarah, but Sarah's been gone for weeks. I think Clara is one of them now. I realized with horror that Thomas had not just hidden his daughter, he'd imprisoned something else. The skeleton in the crawl space wasn't Clara. It was whatever had possessed her. For months after the motel was demolished, I was haunted. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., convinced I heard scratching beneath my floorboards. My girlfriend, Lisa, tried to reassure me. "Baby, it's just the pipes. You're overtired." But one night, I heard it clearly, a child's laugh, muffled but unmistakable. I tore up the living room carpet, flashlight in hand. Beneath the floorboards, I found a single strand of blonde hair and a faint smell of decay. I moved out the next day. The apartment was condemned, but no one believed me. The landlord said it was old plumbing. Now I live in a high-rise with reinforced concrete floors. Still, sometimes when the wind blows just right, I hear it, the whisper, the laughter, and I wonder if it's ever truly over. Some things don't stay buried. Some rooms refuse to be forgotten. My first off-campus apartment was exactly what you'd expect for a broke college student. It was in a creaky, pre-war building with questionable plumbing and a landlord who seemed to communicate exclusively through grunts and sighs. But it was mine. A small studio, just big enough for a bed, a desk, and a tiny kitchenette. The layout was a bit strange. A long, narrow hallway stretched from the main room to the bathroom, and at the very end of this hall, right next to the bathroom door, was a closet. Or what used to be a closet. The door had been painted over so many times that its edges were completely sealed to the frame. The knob had been removed, and the indentation was filled with spackle and painted over. When I asked the landlord about it during the walkthrough, he just shrugged and said it had been sealed off for structural reasons decades ago. I didn't think much of it. It was just a dead space, a quirk of an old building. The first few nights were fine. I was enjoying the freedom, the quiet. But on the third night, I was woken up by a sound. It was faint but distinct, a soft scratching. I assumed it was a mouse in the walls and rolled over, but the sound was deliberate, rhythmic. It seemed to be coming from the end of the hall, from the wall where the sealed closet was. It lasted for maybe a minute, then stopped. The next night, it happened again. This time I sat up in bed, listening. It was just after 3 a.m. The scratching was slow, methodical, Scrape, scrape, scrape. Not the frantic scrabbling of a rodent. This was different. On the third night, when the sound started again, I got out of bed. The old floorboards groaned under my feet as I walked down the narrow hall. The air was cold. I stood in front of the painted-over door, my ear almost touching the wall. The scratching was louder here. It was definitely coming from inside. My heart was pounding, but curiosity got the better of me. I balled up my fist and knocked on the wall 3 times. Thump, thump, thump. The scratching stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. And then, from the other side of the wall, came a single soft reply. Thump. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I called my landlord. He was immediately annoyed, almost angry. I told you, that unit's been sealed for years, he grunted. There's nothing in there. It's probably just the pipes. Mind your business and stop banging on the walls. He hung up before I could argue. But after that night, things started to get weird inside my apartment. Small things. I'd come home from class and a book on my desk would be moved a few inches from where I left it. I'd open the fridge to find the carton of milk, which I always kept on the door, was now on the top shelf, pushed all the way to the back. I started feeling a constant, prickling sensation on the back of my neck, that unshakable feeling of being watched. I tried to convince myself I was just stressed, sleep-deprived, but the feeling grew stronger. I became convinced someone was coming into my apartment while I was gone. I spent money I didn't have to get a new deadbolt installed on the front door. I would lock it meticulously every time I left. But the small disturbances didn't stop. A fork left on the counter when I knew I'd put it in the sink. The TV volume turned down 1 notch from where I always left it. It was subtle enough to make me question my own sanity, but consistent enough to terrify me. The scratching from the closet wall continued, every night, like clockwork. One Saturday, I couldn't take it anymore. I knew the answer had to be behind that wall. I went to the hardware store and bought a crowbar and a hammer. Back in the apartment, I stood in the narrow hallway, the tools feeling heavy in my hands. This was a stupid idea. I'd lose my security deposit, maybe even get evicted. But the thought of spending one more night in that place with the scratching, with the feeling of being watched, it was worse. I started prying at the edge of the sealed door. The old wood splintered. It took almost an hour of sweaty, frantic work, but finally, a section of the door panel broke loose. A wave of foul air hit me and I gagged. It was a smell of stale sweat, dampness, and rotting food. I used my phone's flashlight to peer into the darkness. It wasn't a closet. It was a narrow, cramped passageway. My hands were shaking, but I had to know. I squeezed through the opening. The space was tiny, maybe 4 feet wide and 10 feet long, running parallel to my hallway. It was an unacknowledged part of the building, a void between apartments, and someone had been living there. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw a filthy, small mattress on the floor. Next to it were empty cans of beans, plastic water bottles, and piles of old clothes. My stomach turned. This person, whoever they were, hadn't just been living in the walls. With the disturbances in my apartment, it was clear they had a key. They had been coming into my space, my sanctuary, while I was gone. Maybe even while I was asleep. Then my light fell on something else. A small stack of Polaroid pictures, scattered on the dirty mattress. I picked one up. My blood ran cold. It was a picture of me. I was asleep in my bed, the photo taken from the foot of the bed, looking down at me. My mouth was slightly open, my face slack in sleep. I grabbed another. It was me sitting at my desk, my back to the camera, studying. Another showed me on the couch, watching TV. There were dozens of them, a complete catalog of my private life. I frantically shuffled through them until I reached the last one, the one on top of the pile. It was a photo of me from the night before, asleep. The flash was bright, washing out my features. On the white border at the bottom, written in a shaky, spidery script, was yesterday's date. I don't remember dropping the photos. I don't remember scrambling back through the hole in the wall. The next thing I knew, I was on the street outside my building, hyperventilating, my phone clutched in my hand. I called the police. I never went back inside that apartment again. My dad had to go with the police a few days later to pack up my things. They said the hidden room was empty. Whoever had been living there was gone. The landlord evicted me for the property damage. I live in a new building now, a modern one with thin walls and no history, but I can't shake the paranoia. I double-check the locks a dozen times before I go to bed. Every creak of the floorboards in the apartment above me makes me freeze. And sometimes late at night, when the entire building is silent, I swear, I can still hear a faint, deliberate scratching sound coming from inside the walls. My husband, Mark, and I bought our first house 3 years ago. It was one of those old Victorian places that was way too cheap to make any sense a fixer-upper in the truest sense of the term. The floors groaned, the wind whispered through the walls, and there was a strange, persistent chill in the upstairs hallway. But we were young and ambitious, and we saw potential under all the dust and decay. We spent the first few months on the main floor, but eventually we had to tackle the upstairs guest bedroom. The walls were covered in layers of hideous, peeling floral wallpaper. I was scraping away a particularly stubborn section near the corner when my putty knife slipped and hit the wall with a loud thunk. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the solid thud of plaster and lath. It was hollow, a deep, resonant, very hollow sound. I knocked again with my knuckles. The sound echoed. There was a space back there. Mark came in to see what the noise was, and I showed him. His eyes lit up with the same foolish curiosity that was burning in mine. We should have stopped there. We should have patched the wall and pretended we never heard it. But we didn't. Mark got a small sledgehammer and a pry bar. An hour later, we had broken through the drywall and plaster, revealing a dark, perfectly framed doorway that wasn't on any of the house's blueprints. There was no door, just a dark, yawning space that seemed to breathe cold air into the room. The room inside was small and windowless. The air was thick with the smell of dust and something else, something faintly metallic like old pennies. But it was the back wall that made us stop dead in the doorway. It was completely covered, from floor to ceiling, with tall, thin, antique mirrors. They were set side by side, their silvering tarnished and spotted with age. They reflected the dusty floor, the jagged opening we'd made, and the light from the guest room spilling into the darkness. I took a hesitant step inside, and that's when I felt it. A cold dread that started in my stomach and spread through my entire body. I looked at my reflection in the center mirror, except there wasn't one. The room was there, perfectly replicated in the glass. The doorway behind me was there, but the space where I should have been was empty. I wasn't in the reflection. "Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you see this?" He was standing right behind me, and his voice was tight with disbelief. "Yeah, I see it. I'm not there either." We stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to rationalize it. A trick of the light, a weird angle, some property of the old, leaded glass. And as we stared, trying to will our reflections into existence, something moved. Not in our room, in the reflection. From the edge of the mirrored room, a figure stepped into view. It was tall and shadowy, its form indistinct. It moved with a cautious, hesitant posture, almost as if it were the one who had just discovered the room. It stopped in the center of the reflection, right where I was standing in the real world. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure in the mirror slowly lifted its head. I couldn't make out a face, just a horrible, blurry absence where one should have been. And then, as if it could sense us, it tilted its head. A grotesque, jagged grin stretched impossibly wide across the blank space of its face. I stumbled backward, crashing into a stack of drywall we'd leaned against the wall. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet house. In the mirror, the figure's head snapped toward the source of the sound. Its non-existent eyes locked onto the empty space where we stood. It knew we were there. Then it started to move. Slowly, deliberately, it began walking toward the surface of the mirror. And we heard a sound. Faint, dry, scraping noise. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the sound of long fingernails dragging against the other side of the glass. Testing it. Looking for a way through. We ran. We didn't even bother to close the door to the guest room. We fled downstairs and out of the house. We spent that night at a hotel. The next day, we went back with a large piece of plywood and a drill. We didn't look in the room. We just screwed the plywood over the opening we'd made, driving 3-inch screws into the wall studs until it was completely sealed. We tried to forget it. We told ourselves it was a shared hallucination, a trick played on us by dust, fatigue, and an old, strange house. We finished the renovations, never speaking of the room in the reflection. But last night, as I was lying in bed, I heard it again. That soft, patient, scraping sound. It was coming from inside the wall of our bedroom. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, for almost an hour before I worked up the courage to just look. I slowly turned my head and glanced at the vanity mirror across the room. My heart stopped. In the reflection, the door to our bedroom was open just a crack, a sliver of dark hallway visible beyond it. But in reality, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that the door was closed and locked.